Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's event. I'm Janet Steele. I'm the new director of the Seeger Center, and I'm also a professor of journalism in GW's School of Media and Public Affairs. Before we get started, a couple of very minor housekeeping announcements. Remember to mute your phones. I only remembered a few minutes ago because it's very distracting to panelists when the phone rings. And also, during the question and answer period, if you'll wait to be called on, and then everybody has a microphone in front of them. And if you look at the little image, it's actually, as Adam explained to me, it's actually a person speaking into a microphone. I thought it was an ear listening, but it's a push that button, a red light will come on, and then your microphone will be live. So that's for the question and answer period. So, as you know, the Seeger Center is really the only center of its type in the Washington, D.C. area, hosting so many events about Taiwan, China, and other parts of Asia. The purpose of our center is to improve the quality of research and education about Asia and to promote greater dialogue between the policy community, the academic community, the public, and students. So I'm very pleased to announce that we, along with the GW Institute for Korean Studies, have recently been named as the only National Resource Center for East Asia in the Washington, D.C. area. And this is a huge deal. The NRC designation enhances our ability to engage the broader community, including students, K-12 educators, minority-serving institutions, policymakers, military veterans, journalists, and the general public on regional and global issues of importance. Our active and vibrant Taiwan program, the largest among DC area universities, is an important and special part of our National Resource Center for East Asian Studies. So we're very happy to be hosting today's program, which is part of our Taiwan event series. Today we have 6 very distinguished speakers and 2 equally distinguished moderators, and they're going to focus on the topic of assessing Taiwan's security dynamics in a competitive international environment. Our first panel, Strategies for Security, is going to be moderated by my colleague, Professor Robert Sutter, the winner of this year's Michael Brown Research Award, which is a very distinguished Elliott School Prize, and he will introduce our first panel. But first, I'm delighted to welcome Deputy Representative of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in the U.S., Johnson Chang, to deliver some welcoming remarks. DCM Chang is no stranger to Washington, having served a number of terms in both D.C. and Chicago. He has bachelor's and master's degrees in international law and diplomacy and has done advanced work at the University of Oxford, the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, and Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And as a professor of journalism, I was especially pleased to learn that his oldest son is currently studying journalism at the University of Missouri in Columbia, or Mizzou as they call it. So DCM Chang, we are so happy and so honored to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Janet, for your kind introduction. I especially appreciate your invitation for me to participate into this great seminar on Taiwan security. Well, it's my 3rd time serving here in DC, and I have gladly witnessed our long-standing partnership with the Seeger Center for Asian Studies at the George Washington University since I first came to DC 20 years ago in 2003. Through our educational exchange program with the Seeger Center, Taiwanese scholars or government officials can have wonderful opportunities to engage with the first-rated policy experts, such as our distinguished speakers here today, and broaden our perspectives on certain issues which matter to our interest. We highly value and cherish our cooperation with Janet, Deepa, and your colleagues at the George Washington University. Thank you so much. As Taiwanese people will cast their votes next January 2024 to elect their new president and the parliament. Our panel discussion today on Taiwan security is timely, insightful, and even strategic. My colleagues at our office in DC work closely with the United States and the like-minded partners to make sure Taiwanese people will continue to have another free and a fair election without being interfered by the threat of force or intimidation from autocracy in Beijing. Taiwan stands tall to defend our democracy and freedom and the common values we believe in. We deeply appreciate our security dialogues with like-minded partners being expanded not only in geographical areas, but also in a substance for more diverse topics, from strengthening traditional military capabilities, responding to new challenges in gray zone tactics, to building up economic security, such as resilience of global supply chains, or cybersecurity and countering cognitive warfare. Taiwan has been working hard comprehensively to defend our freedom and democracy around the clock. In addition to deepening our cooperation with like-minded partners, we will also continue to exercise self-restraint to maintain stability across the Taiwan Strait. Given we understand it will be tremendous impacts on global economy and stability if there is a military conflict in the Taiwan Strait. We will do everything possible to prevent it. Finally, I never miss an opportunity to commemorate the great contribution for Dr. Gaston Seeger, in which the Seeger Center is named after, for his support of a stronger U.S.-Taiwan relations during some challenging moments in his time to safeguard our common values and prosperity. And thank you so much again for having me here. And I look forward to our discussion as in Taiwan, we're celebrating a holiday. Let me say a happy Mid-Autumn Day. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Bob Sutter. I'm here at the Elliott School. Very happy to be part of the faculty here. I'm going to be moderating today's session, and we have this is just a remarkable occasion. The field of China-Taiwan issues has emerged as a very important field. It's just very impressive how it's emerged over the past decades. And here we have three specialists who are really just, this is the very best that you can have in this field. We're so lucky to have them here at the Seeger Center. And Gaston Seeger would be very proud of this. I knew Gaston very well, and he was very much into this sort of thing indeed. And so so it's a great privilege for me to be the chair of this. And I just, we don't have a lot of time, and I know we have many things to discuss. And so I'm just going to give some brief introductions to the three speakers that we have here today. Their bios were distributed at the invitation, and so you should be able to access them. They're very worthwhile looking at. But this field, as I said, has emerged in enormous ways. And someone like Lonnie Henley, our first speaker, he was central to U.S. intelligence assessments of China-Taiwan issues for decades. And let me assure you, there were many of them in this period. And Lonnie was there through the whole process. His service, U.S. government service, really is outstanding, truly outstanding. Equally outstanding is the record of Bonnie Glaser, who has worked in very effective and policy impactful ways in prominent American think tanks, sharpening and deepening our understanding of these kinds of issues for the benefit of good U.S. policy, but also for the greater good of the Asia-Pacific region. And then last, but certainly not least, is David Sachs, who has done remarkable work in recent years in placing the China-Taiwan relationship at the center of attention at the Council on Foreign Relations and in the broader U.S. and international foreign policy communities. So it's really amazing what we have here today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Lonnie, and the topic of his address relates to. Of course, the topics are very important. And Lonnie's going to deal with defending Taiwan and deterrence strategy. Obviously, extremely important. And as a person with his background and his interests, we should get some excellent insights. So about 12 to 15 minutes each.
Building this, do I need? Slide. Okay, so my little presentation today, currency illustration, prompted by what I observed of a great deal of discussion centering around the proposition that we need to strengthen deterrence against China to prevent China from taking military action against Taiwan. There's been a lot of calls to strengthen both deterrence by denial, that is, convincing China that it cannot succeed in a military operation against Taiwan, and deterrence by punishment against China. The cost would be high. My thesis today is that I disagree with the assertion that deterrence is weak and in danger of failing. I think deterrence is very strong and it is amply deterred from approaching action. But that deterrence is not sufficient to prevent action. Explain what I mean. We've seen a lot of discussion about the needs to demonstrate U.S. resolve to defend Taiwan, to increase U.S. military preparedness for Taiwan conflict, and I've written myself about ways I think there are gaps in that U.S. preparedness, about the need to strengthen Taiwan's defenses, and even recent proposal from General Brett Thayer that we need to deploy tactical nuclear weapons on Taiwan to ensure that any conflict with escalation will be used and thereby strengthen deterrence. And on the against China, right? And on the deterrence by punishment side of the ledger, there's been several years ago the buzzwords were cost imposition strategy. We need to find a way to make sure that China understood that how much damage a conflict over Taiwan would do to China and its ambitions in the world. Now, the latest government is that we need whole of government strategy. And so the two assumptions that underlie this perspective are assumptions or perhaps assertions. One, that deterrence is waning, and two, that if we can sufficiently bolster deterrence, that will be sufficient to prevent. So, and I disagree with both those propositions. So on the first proposition, I believe that the deterrence of China is extremely effective. If conquering Taiwan were cheap and easy, they'd have done it. They don't, because it's not easy and it's not cheap. And also, but come to the but. There's in any any Chinese operation to conquer Taiwan, the risk of military operation failure is very high. This is an extraordinarily difficult operation. Any power to conquer. A larger amphibious operation than anyone has ever done before. With geographical advantages for the defender and geographical obstacles for the operation. In addition to the inherent difficulty of the operation, there is the very high likelihood that China would have to defeat U.S. military forces getting into conflict, and U.S. forces have spent a lot of effort in the past 15 years or so bolstering our ability to defeat amphibious landing operations. So on the deterrence by denial side, the you cannot succeed side of deterrence, there is the risk is high enough that offers as much deterrent capacity as is available. That is, in as much as deterrence can affect Chinese decision-making,
that deterrence is as high as it can be in that regard. Now, obviously, we have to keep it. We have to continue investing in our operational capabilities to make sure that if there is a war, we win that war and not China, and make sure that China understands that. And on the side, however, the deterrence is even higher. The main reason I think China has never, not because they couldn't, although for a long time, for the last 10 years or so, it has been the case that they have the capacity to attack Taiwan. It's that the cost to China of a war over Taiwan would be enormous. It would endanger every other thing that the Chinese care about. China's economic development, its position in the world, its diplomatic posture, domestic stability at home, and even the whole. And so even if there were some danger that deterrence by denial was reaching some tipping point, deterrence by punishment is still enormously excessive to the requirement. The Chinese will be as deterred as they can be by the prospect of threats to everything else that matters. My main thesis, however, is that deterrence is not enough. If Chinese come to the conclusion that military force is the only way they can ever regain control of Taiwan, then they will take action, take military action, despite the risk of operation, despite the enormous high cost. Now, for the past 60 plus years, it has been the perception of Chinese leaders that military action is not necessary because nonviolent approaches to unification remain viable. And it remains the preferred course of action of Chinese leaders to emphasize, to build China's strength, build China's prestige in the world, and build towards a day when unification with Taiwan happens without the need to use force. Obviously, plan B is, if necessary, use force. But plan A is regain control of Taiwan in the long term without using force. The great danger comes at those points where they perceive that that cannot succeed. That use of force is the only remaining option. So my assertion is that while we must maintain deterrence, if we don't also address dissuasion, then deterrence will fail, regardless of how much military capacity we have, regardless of how much cost we can impose on China. They will take action if they think military action is their only remaining option. So our policy should be to encourage them to believe that peaceful unification is possible. They may be wrong about that. We may argue for a variety of reasons that peaceful unification is never going to happen by many things, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, many other things. But it doesn't matter what we think, it matters enormously what Chinese leaders think. And if they think that nonviolent paths to unification can succeed, then they will stay on that in order to avoid the enormous costs that would come with the war. So we have a delicate balance, which I think we have not been doing a very good job of in recent years. We must continue building the military capabilities that are necessary for the China cannot succeed without operation. It must be seen. We must also do what we can to ensure that the costs remain enormously high. That's mostly doesn't require action on our part because those enormous costs come from the fact of the war, not necessarily from additional cost imposition that we might be able to take care of. So we have to do those things. But as we do those things, we have to encourage the Chinese to continue in their perhaps mistaken belief that peaceful reunification remains a viable action. Because when they stop believing that, things get really ugly. So my concern is that we seem to be, in recent years, determined to convince them they must attack Taiwan, that nothing else can possibly work. And that, I think, has to be put to that.
Right, there you go. We'll now turn to our second speaker, Bonnie Glaser, whose topic is alliance politics in Taiwan. Bonnie, please.
Thank you so much, Bob, and thanks to all of you for coming. So I'm going to talk about the role of alliances in Taiwan security. And the role of alliances is clearly increasing. Some aspects of the role of alliances has been expanding, and I expect that this trend will continue in the future. I think there's more work to be done. I'm going to trace some of the developments in recent years and then talk about what I think should be done in the future. Prior to the Biden administration taking power, my sense was that the focus of alliance cooperation, as led by the United States and our outreach to our allies, was really to involve alliances in supporting Taiwan's participation in the United Nations, and of course, especially in the World Health Organization. So this has been ongoing for many years, getting support for allies to speak out in favor of Taiwan's expanded participation in the UN and its affiliated agencies. There was very limited defense coordination. Of course, we know that for years, I don't know exactly when it started, but Australia has been, for example, sailing through the Taiwan Strait, although they don't make those transits public. Obviously, with notification to the United States, but I would not call that sort of coordination. So there have been other discussions that are going on in the defense area. But what we've really seen is an expansion of this, the ways in which the United States is working with allies to strengthen deterrence. So I'm going to talk about that. So the first thing that I want to focus on is the rhetoric, because the rhetoric matters. Each of our allies has taken steps to signal that they have a stake in the preservation of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And the language that is being used in these kinds of statements, many of them jointly with the United States or even multilateral statements, are very clearly signaling this. So we saw, for example, shortly after the Biden administration took power, I believe the first such statement was in April of 2021, and that was between the United States and Japan. And President Biden and then Prime Minister Suga said in a joint statement, "We underscore the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and encourage the peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues." And that was the first reference by leaders of the two countries in a statement to Taiwan since 1969. So really, really quite significant. Then the following month, there was a South Korean statement with the United States. And this was, of course, then South Korean President Moon and President Biden. And they signed a statement that said that both leaders emphasized the importance of preservation of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So very significant statement by South Korea alongside the United States. And then in June, there was a G7 leaders statement that essentially repeated very similar language, preserving peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. And that was the first time. We also had a visit by President Biden to Europe in that same month in June, and there was a US-EU summit statement that used similar language, again, emphasizing peace and stability across the strait and encouraging peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues. At the same time, there was a 2+2 statement with Australia, which was very lengthy. I thought was very notable at the time. It noted that Taiwan was a leading democracy, a critical partner for both countries, emphasized Taiwan's meaningful participation in international organizations, and also reiterating support for not only peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues, but without resorting to threats or coercion. And they also expressed their commitment to working with Taiwan, coordinating with Taiwan on donor issues, donor coordination issues in the Pacific. So it's a very long statement, and that was really unprecedented. So now what we really see is virtually all US statements with allies now include Taiwan. And some of this language is now being updated to include other things. So I will cite the G7 foreign minister statement, which I believe was from about a week ago, reaffirmed the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait as indispensable to security and prosperity in the international community, and called for peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues. So these statements are sending signals to Beijing that this is not a US-China issue of preventing war in the Taiwan Strait, preserving peace, strengthening Taiwan's overall security, protecting Taiwan's democracy. These are statements that signal China that this is an international issue. And I think this is really important because internationalization of the Taiwan Strait will help, I believe, to protect Taiwan, and it is part of an overall strategy of deterrence. So I'll say a little bit on the defense side, as I know that David is going to talk more about this. But there's really been some notable things that have happened. So certainly expansion of US cooperation with Japan to prepare for various Taiwan contingencies. And this really started before the Biden administration. There were media reports that have stated that Japan's self-defense forces in the US military have drawn up a joint operation plan that would enable the establishment of temporary bases along the Nansei Island chain in the event of a contingency. And some of these reports say that there's been a division of roles and missions between Tokyo and Washington. So again, just public reporting. We know, of course, the AUKUS arrangements, a lot of things of motivations that I think that drove Australia to want to work with the UK and the US in producing, of course, submarines that will enable them to operate, because they're nuclear powered, much farther away from Australia. But concern about deterring a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, I would posit, was one of them. And we see now Canadian warships sailing alongside the United States and conducting transits in the Taiwan Strait. I think there's been at least 3, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're now taking place fairly regularly. Some of the European governments have also loosened restrictions on approving licenses for components for weapons that are being sold to Taiwan. And the indigenous submarine that Taiwan is producing we know that there's some European companies as well as former European naval officers and engineers are involved in that effort. To date, NATO has not mentioned Taiwan in a joint communique. It would be interesting to track going forward whether Taiwan is included. China was only included for the first time a couple of years ago. But NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg visited Japan and South Korea earlier this year, and he discussed NATO's concerns about that what is happening in Europe today with Russia's invasion of Ukraine could occur in Asia tomorrow. And I would suggest that the war in Ukraine has really highlighted for European governments the risk of having a major power invade a smaller country. And so this has really brought the issue, or one of the reasons that has brought this issue to the forefront in Europe. There are other non-defense actions that I want to highlight that are being taken by individual countries to signal their support for Taiwan. And of course, foreign policy is, we say, is the competence of individual European countries. It's not necessarily all pursued by the EU. We saw Germany, for example, send an education minister to Taiwan earlier this year, and there have been a slew of parliamentary delegations that are going from Europe, just as we see many delegations from our Congress going to Taiwan, from South Korea, Australia, and many in Europe. So the last thing that I want to talk about is really talk about maybe some of the other reasons that are driving Europe to become more involved in this effort. That's where I sit from the German Marshall Fund and talk to a lot of these European governments, and then some of the next steps that might be taken. And it's my sense that discussions about the relevance of Taiwan's security to European interests has really advanced considerably within government circles. And this is true at the EU level, where the EU has now consultations with the United States on Indo-Pacific security, and then separately on issues pertaining to China and Taiwan. And Taiwan has really become a central focus. And one of the concerns that I think has really influenced the thinking in Europe is the recognition that the economic cost to Europe of any kind of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait would be catastrophic for their interests. And one of the things that has, I think, brought this home to leaders in Europe, and including high-level officials in the European Commission, is there was a report that many of you may have seen that was released, I believe, late last year by the Rhodium Group. And essentially that report assumed, it took as a baseline contingency, a Chinese imposition of a blockade around Taiwan, but without any kinetic action. And I myself think that's highly unlikely, but you have to start somewhere and estimate what the cost that would be, what cost that would lead to for Taiwan, for China, and of course for the rest of the world. And they came up with, their methodology is very clear. They lay out their assumptions. They came up with a cost of $2.5 trillion, which is an annualized cost to the global economy. And I think European governments looked at the impact on them and their economies of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which was far less than that. And again, that's before any shots are fired. So I think that really had an impact on governments in Europe, who sometimes think of Taiwan and Indo-Pacific as very far away from them geographically. But of course, we are very connected in an interdependent global economy. So the last thing I just want to say is what I think is important, and this applies not just to our allies in Europe and in Asia, but also really at home for us in the United States. And that is that we're not doing enough to bring along our publics in terms of really their understanding and support for Taiwan. And public opinion polls are really all over the map on this. But we do an annual public opinion poll at GMF, which is called Transatlantic Trends, and you can find it online. And we included a question about Taiwan where we essentially asked respondents, I believe it was in 13 European countries, and then we polled in the US and Canada about what they would support if China attacked Taiwan, and gave them various options, and they could pick as many as they wanted to. And so this would include supporting with diplomacy, sending arms, sending troops. And so it's a range of choices, and imposing sanctions. That was another category. And we found the highest support was in the UK in most of these categories, and yet that was only 16% supporting sending arms and 6% supporting sending troops. And all of the other countries in Europe were lower in those categories. The average of the 12 European countries polled that supported imposing sanctions was 22.6%. So I think we really have to talk more with our publics about why Taiwan matters to us, and why we need to step up our support for Taiwan and take actions that would strengthen deterrence. And the last thing that I'll say, which I should have said earlier, was on this topic of imposing sanctions on Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attack. And this is a conversation that's certainly going on with the European Union as well as our allies in Asia. And I have heard that there have been essentially warnings that have been conveyed to senior officials in Beijing by European leaders, that if force were to be used, that there would be serious consequences. So people from European countries, I think, rightfully say we shouldn't reveal our hands. We shouldn't be telling China what we're going to do in advance. But I believe that those conversations are at a more granular level as to what kind of steps could be taken, and lessons that are being drawn from the actions we have taken against Russia. I think those are ongoing conversations and are also very important. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was just excellent, and really covered that issue nicely. And now we'll turn to David Sachs, who will deal with strategic signaling and U.S. posture. David, please.
Yeah, thank you to the Elliott School and the Seeger Center for having me on this panel today. So the word strategic is in the title of my prompt, so I think my fellow panelists will know what direction I'm going in. And I think that there is an adjustment the United States should make to its strategic signaling, and that is to shift from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity. And for those of you who are perhaps less familiar with these terms of art dealing with Taiwan and China and cross-strait issues, essentially for a number of decades right now, the United States has not said definitively whether it would come to Taiwan's defense in the in the case of Chinese aggression against Taiwan, nor has it said it will not come to Taiwan's defense. And I would argue that that did work for decades for a number of reasons, but the fundamental underpinnings of that policy have shifted, and our policy should shift to take that into account. So the first thing that I would say is that strategic ambiguity, almost by design, placed an equal emphasis on deterring both a Taiwanese declaration of independence as well as Chinese aggression against Taiwan. And the shift that I think has occurred is that a Taiwanese declaration of independence, in my view, is not really something we should be that concerned about. There is public polling on this question in Taiwan, and yes, Taiwanese identity continues to rise, Chinese identity continues to fall on the island. But when asked this specific question about whether you support the status quo, whether you want unification immediately or in the future, or whether you want independence immediately or at some point in the future, the majority of the voters or the respondents support the status quo in some form or another. I think that the experience of the Chen Shui-bian administration in the early 2000s brought a recognition in Taiwan that if it is seen as provoking the PRC, it would cause irreparable damage potentially to US-Taiwan relations, lessen the likelihood of US defense of Taiwan, as well as do significant damage to what Bonnie was talking about in terms of getting allies and partners on board to sanction China or support military operations. So I think that we need to now shift most of our effort to deterring a Chinese attack on Taiwan rather than focusing on both sides of the coin here. And why I say that we should put more emphasis on deterring a Chinese attack is because I think that China has fundamentally changed especially over the past decade. And so when I look at Chinese behavior right now, I see China that is far more assertive in the region and is far more risk acceptant. And so we can point to the militarization of the South China Sea, even after Xi Jinping pledged standing next to President Obama that he would not do so. We could see a deadly clash on the disputed border between China and India. Also, the East China Sea and China now putting much more of a presence near the Senkaku Islands and squeezing Japan there as well. We can talk about economic coercion, both in Europe and the Indo-Pacific. And I also think that what we've seen is China being far more comfortable turning to the military tool of national power. And again, this is evident in the incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, but also in the South China Sea and elsewhere. On the US side, I also think that there are concerns about our resolve and commitment, whether that is because of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, whether that's seeing the debate in the United States on aid to Ukraine and how that has become a really fraught issue with eroding support for providing aid to Ukraine, whether that's not enforcing the red line in Syria. I think that abroad there is a sense that the United States is growing increasingly isolationist and is not necessarily committed to these types of interventions. And so I think what we also need to do is look at what the region looks like the day after a Chinese annexation of Taiwan. And to me, the consequences justify a shift to strategic clarity. So first, our allies and partners. How do they respond, or how do we believe they will respond if the PRC takes over Taiwan without any U.S. intervention or support? I think we see the stronger countries in the region, like Japan and South Korea, pursue some form of strategic autonomy, potentially developing nuclear weapons, questioning whether they can rely on the United States for their defense. I think the weaker countries in the region, primarily in Southeast Asia, end up doing some form of bandwagoning with China and cutting the best deal that they can. We have to think about Taiwan's position in the first island chain. This isn't something that we can just wish away, but Taiwan's geography matters a lot to Japan, and the defense of the Senkakus as well as the Southwest Islands and even Okinawa. It matters for protecting global commerce and sea lanes of communication. There's the economic fallout that Bonnie mentioned, $2.5 trillion at a bare minimum to the global economy. And there is what we heard Johnson talk about, 23 million people with democracy and shared values to the United States. So I think that strategic clarity recognizes these stakes and also provides tangible benefits, which is that it enables more coordination and cooperation between the United States and Taiwan, and I can get into that at a later point, as well as with the United States and its allies. Now, there are a number of critiques of strategic clarity, and I'll just go through a couple of them. Some argue that it's inconsistent with the US One China policy. I've looked at all of the documents more times than I can count. But strategic clarity has nothing to do with diplomatic recognition of Taiwan. It is not saying that we are going to open up an embassy in Taiwan or resurrect the military advisory group that we had in Taiwan. we can maintain and we should maintain our unofficial relationship with Taiwan while shifting to clarity. I will note, however, that in our One China policy and the Taiwan Relations Act, it says that our One China policy is based on our expectation that cross-strait issues will be resolved peacefully. And so we should keep that in mind. When President Reagan issued the third communique as well as the 6 assurances, he conveyed to Deng Xiaoping that the United States had an abiding interest in a peaceful resolution of cross-strait differences, which many scholars interpreted as reserving the right to intervene on Taiwan's behalf in a contingency. Some have argued that strategic clarity will start the war that it seeks to prevent, that China will use this and say, you know, the United States is committed to the permanent separation of Taiwan. Any peaceful resolution cannot be achieved, so we will start a war regardless of the costs. What I will say here is that President Biden has on 4 occasions essentially adopted strategic clarity, and we didn't have a war with China after those statements. And then finally, some will say we have other options. Basically, the Ukraine model will work for Taiwan. So why shift to strategic clarity, preserve our optionality, and just through military aid and assistance, Taiwan can fend off a Chinese attack. And I think that that's fundamentally flawed. For a number of reasons, I don't think that the Ukraine model will work in this scenario. And I think we need to be realistic that if we determine it is in our interest to defend Taiwan against a Chinese attack, that the only thing, in my view, that will do so is direct US intervention. So let me shift a little bit to the US force posture here and what we can do to bolster deterrence. I think that the NDS, the National Defense Strategy, gets it right when it says that China is our pacing challenge. I would add as a corollary to that, the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Eli Ratner's testimony maybe a year and a half ago, where he stated that Taiwan is the pacing scenario for the Department of Defense. So China as the pacing challenge, Taiwan as the pacing scenario is how we are, I think, within the Pentagon viewing this issue and what we need to do. I also want to give credit to the Biden administration for identifying that and also to, you know, making, I think, significant progress on access and basing, which is enormously difficult. It is dealing with fundamental questions of sovereignty of our partners and allies in the region, but we've made big progress, whether that's with the Philippines and 4 new sites under the EDCA agreement, whether that's with Japan, with the outcome of the 2+2 meeting held last year, increased access to the Southwest Islands of Japan, which is closest in proximity to Taiwan, more exercises in those islands, pre-positioning material, and things of that nature. AUKUS with Australia, yes, it will take time to come to fruition, but if Australia has nuclear subs in the water, I think that complicates the PRC operational planning and the assumptions that they have to make. I'll say a couple of things, though, that I think we can do more on, and that is, I'll start with Taiwan. Taiwan's defense budget has almost doubled in the past 7 years under President Tsai, and it is now roughly 2.5% of GDP, so above the standard that we set for our NATO allies. But I think that Taiwan, as a rich society, I think that it is not out of the question for Taiwan to spend about 4 to 5% of GDP on defense. By comparison, the United States Cold War average of defense spending was 7.5% of GDP, and we were still able to maintain, you know, the elements of our society that we want in terms of a social safety net and other things. And I think Taiwan can do the same. Israel spends about 4 to 5% of its GDP on defense, and I think Taiwan should be in that boat. Just as important as how much Taiwan spends on defense is how it spends that money. And here you see a lot of US officials talking about the buzzwords of the day, asymmetric and innovative. Essentially, Taiwan should buy a lot of very small, cheap things that it can distribute throughout the island. And what they're talking about are missiles, mines, small radars, and things of that nature. And I think that that's all correct, and Taiwan can do a lot on its own to bolster production. We see President Tsai investing in a domestic drone capability. That was one of the lessons I think clearly learned from Ukraine and Taiwan. We have an interest in that succeeding, and I think hopefully the United States can think creatively about joint production with Taiwan, as well as potentially technology transfer and other things to get that off the ground. Bonnie mentioned the indigenous defense submarine, which Taiwan unveiled yesterday. There is a heated debate, I would say, in the United States on whether this is, on the one hand, a big waste of money, $1.5 billion for the first hull, or whether this is an example of a kind of asymmetric capability that Taiwan should be pursuing. I personally support the IDS program. I hope Taiwan builds about 10 of them, and I think that complicates the PRC's planning, but it is a very expensive thing to do. And I think that the key thing is that it can't come at the expense of the missiles, mines, and other capabilities that we talk about. So my answer is that Taiwan should pursue that, but it should pursue everything else as well. Japan, Bonnie mentioned this, from the US perspective, this is our most important alliance relationship for Taiwan contingencies in particular. To be clear, I think we cannot defend Taiwan without Japan's support. And so this is everything from, at a minimum, whether the United States can use bases, airfields, ports, and other facilities in Japan, to whether the Japanese self-defense forces provide rear area support, air defense, logistical support, and things of that nature. As I noted before, we've made a lot of progress on this. Japan unilaterally is significantly increasing its defense budget, pursuing a counterstrike capability, establishing a permanent joint headquarters for the self-defense forces, mentioned Taiwan in the joint statement that Bonnie mentioned. And I think that this all really came to a head with the Chinese response to Speaker Pelosi's visit last August, when a missile landed in Japan's exclusive economic zone. And that really brought home the fact that regardless of what Japan decides to do, it is basically in the battle space just because of geography. We can do a lot more, though, still, pursuing interoperability with Japan, integrated air and missile defense, anti-surface warfare, anti-submarine warfare, mine warfare capabilities. The list is long, but I think here there's pretty much an open door to doing more with the United States from Tokyo. And there was an article just earlier this week that Japan is looking at lengthening civilian airfields to support military operations, especially in the Southwest Islands, and that type of thing is something that we should encourage. I mentioned the 4 EDCA sites in the Philippines, again, a very positive development. And if you'll note the location of those sites, there's no, I don't think that it is just a coincidence that most of them are abutting Taiwan and the Bashi Strait. AUKUS, I mentioned before. I think that the one area here where there is not as much appetite as I would have thought is in Seoul, is with South Korea. Just in my own interactions, speaking with South Koreans about the Taiwan question, the response that I basically get is, well, our role in a Taiwan contingency is ensuring North Korea doesn't invade South Korea, because that would be the worst case scenario for the United States and open up a second front. So as long as we prevent a war on the peninsula, we've done our job as an ally. And I think that that position is increasingly out of step with Japan, Australia, and even the Philippines, and at some point may prove untenable. And so as South Korea talks about becoming a global pivotal state, and as we pursue trilateral cooperation with South Korea and Japan, I think there is much more that South Korea can and should contribute. On our own capabilities, these are things that are consistently talked about. It is hardening our bases, distributing our force posture, forward deploying Patriot batteries and other assets that would be relevant, investing in submarines and our underwater capabilities. And the final thing that I'll just say before wrapping up is that, to me, the Ukraine, U.S. aid to Ukraine has revealed significant gaps in our defense industrial base. And I think that it's a wake-up call within the United States. I'm not making a call to cut off aid to Ukraine. I think it is important to continue to provide weapons to Ukraine. I think it is an investment that is worth making and is paying off for us. But I do think that we need to look creatively at how we re-energize our defense industrial base, because right now it is not adequate for potential Taiwan contingencies. If you look at some of the wargaming that CSIS has done earlier this year and other sources up there, and look forward to any questions or comments.
That's three wonderful presentations, very important and issues being raised, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions. And like most things in Washington, the most precious thing is time, and we don't have a lot of time right now. So I'm supposed to ask a couple of questions to the group, and I'll do that and try to keep it short. And then we'll move into questions from you folks. Let's look at the issue that Bonnie raised and that others have talked about, the role of allies and partners. And maybe Lonnie can help me here. But over the years, when the U.S. would do an estimate of there's going to be we have to deal with China attacking Taiwan, the basic question was, who's going to be with us? And 20 years ago, we'd say, nobody. Nobody. Allies and partners all have one China policies. They're all going to just stand aside. So all this discussion that Bonnie was talking about, this is quite a change. It's an amazing change if you look at it from that perspective. And that was the case for many years. And so the upshot of this is then, what are they prepared to do? I mean, in this case, and I wanted to just ask a question that would take you at the very end of your discussion. You raised the sort of the Russia-Ukraine model. And I'm thinking in the back of my mind, Joe Biden is sitting down with Putin and saying, you do that, and this is what's going to happen to you. That's what he did. It didn't work, but that's what he did. Are we in a position where Joe Biden could do that now and say, the Europeans or the Japanese are here with us, and they're going to impose cost on you. They're going to add to the types of deterrence that Bonnie and that were talked about in our first presentation. So I guess that's the question I would start us with. Bonnie, it's focused on yours, but the others also can weigh in on this.
I'll just start with a very, very quick comment. I think Lonnie very eloquently laid out all of what is necessary for deterrence. And so that's one piece of it, right? In and of itself, it may not be decisive, but I think that in my conversations with scholars in China, I sense that, first of all, in peacetime, they're much more worried about U.S. What I would call sort of anti-China coalition building, or influencing China through coalition building. And in a potential crisis, what I hear from PLA scholars is that China now knows it must factor in Japanese involvement in a crisis. Many of the contingencies that could occur. So I think we've already had some impact. That impact could be strengthened. I would not dismiss the impact of a message that comes from a leader, whether it be the US president or from other countries, to Xi Jinping about severe consequences of using force. But I believe that the Chinese are already watching what is taking place with Russia, and they are trying to find ways to insulate themselves from those sanctions, and will continue to do that. So I would say this is in my mind one piece. I don't think that it is what would be decisive. And the last thing that I'd say is that the United States and our forces play a really crucial role in the potential defense of Europe. And what Europeans, I think, need to do first and foremost is to ensure that they have the capability to backfill for American forces that might be then sent to the Indo-Pacific theater. And today, they don't have the capability to do that.
Any other comments on this?
Comment that the involvement of of allies in the potential for military operations against China is of more symbolic than military importance, except of course in the case of Japan, because we cannot fight that fight without the use of Japanese air and naval bases. But for the most part, the military operational contribution of those allies is minor to the scale of a potential US-China conflict. The involvement of those allies is primarily a political statement to China on the side of the punishment side of the ledger that, yes, indeed, the cost would be really, really, really high if you had a war over Taiwan. There's an argument about whether you can increase deterrent effect beyond a given point by increasing the deterrent actions. And my feeling is that on the punishment side of the ledger, on the this is going to cost you more than it could possibly benefit you side of the ledger, that there is such enormous cost already highly visible to the Chinese leadership that piling that pile even higher doesn't increase the deterrent effect. It doesn't have any further effect on Chinese decision-making beyond the already enormous costs. So this is my argument against the cost imposition, and that includes the involvement of European allies. That's just another cost imposition strategy.
Great. Let's, I think in the interest of time, we go right to the floor now, and I'll take a question here and gentleman there, and then I'll take a question on this side. So please. Tom, yeah, please introduce yourself and speak into the mic. Make sure the mic is live and speak into the mic. All this is being recorded, so we want to make sure we catch it.
Tom Parker, the Elliott School. Question for Bonnie Glaser. You mentioned the study on the economic consequences of hostilities. Could you repeat the authors of that and also any comments you have about that study, for example, with semiconductors and
Yeah, that very briefly. The study is on the Rhodium Group website. In their Rhodium Group is located in New York. One of the senior partners is Dan Rosen. There are several authors of the report. I can only remember one off the top of my head, who is Agatha Kratz, but more than that. I think it's really worth reading. It is very difficult to do that kind of study because there are various assumptions that you can make. But again, I really think what is helpful is that they make their assumptions clear, they make their methodology clear, and so you can dispute it. But at least it's important to see that somebody is trying to estimate what the cost would be of some contingency. And there's also been another study that was done that's less quantitative, but still interesting to read, especially it's sort of the narrative case at CSIS, which I think was Gerard DePippo and Jude Blanchett, if I'm not mistaken.
Side. The gentleman there, please, with the here.
My name is Peter Humphrey. I'm an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. This concept that China will in some way be deterred by the consequences on its economy of an invasion is a classic example of mirror image thinking and should be disposed of immediately. The big problem for me is magical thinking, which is no one seems to realize the only way to absolutely guarantee Taiwan's independence is to sink the invasion fleet. That's it. Are we anywhere near the capability of sinking the invasion fleet, of sending potentially 500,000 single children to the bottom of the Taiwan Strait? Do we have the anti-ship missiles, the torpedo tubes, the drones? Are they there starting January of next year? None of this is in place. And everything we talk about here is magical thinking until that comes to pass.
That's very clear. Thank you very much for your perspective. Question over here, please. This gentleman here in the front.
Hi, my name is Christopher Woody. I'm a journalist from Business Insider. I wanted to ask about the blockade specifically, given that it seems less of a complex operation than a direct invasion. So firstly, for Lonnie, how would you assess the Chinese naval and air capability to impose and sustain a blockade? And then for Bonnie and David, aside from Japan, how would you rate, the willingness of other U.S. allies to get involved in countering a blockade that it's short of direct invasion, particularly the Philippines and Australia?
This is a scenario I'm sure you've dealt with, so please.
I've dealt with this at length in a paper that's posted on the Naval War College website. But the short answer is that you've got to have the correct vision of what a blockade would look like. If you think in terms of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a picket line of ships at sea, the U.S. Navy could readily defeat that. But that doesn't get cargo into Taiwan ports. And what I worry about, and the reason that sinking the invasion fleet is not sufficient as a military operational course of action, is that unless China quits after its fleet has been sunk, unless China says, oh gosh, we lost shucks, they will continue the fight by continuing to seal off Taiwan's west coast ports. And the problem there is you don't need the PLA Navy to do that. You can do that with a lot of short-range assets from the Chinese coastline and with the emplacement of mines from any number of different platforms. And we, the U.S. and our allies, have no capability to defeat that kind of blockade. And unless we build that kind of capability, then we're left with a strategy of hope. The hope is if we defeat the invasion fleet, that ends the war. And that's fine if it works. If that doesn't end the war, however, then we lose because we can't break that blockade, that long-term effort to seal the West Coast ports on Taiwan, because the East Coast ports are useless for blockade running.
Hand roll, please.
So just briefly, I agree with Lonnie that Japan is the only U.S. ally that's likely to get directly involved in a contingency in the Taiwan Strait. But you mentioned the Philippines, which has recently agreed to 4 additional EDCA sites that giving the U.S. access, and several of those do face the Taiwan Strait. It is interesting that President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. actually said that the Philippines will not allow the United States, or he didn't say any, I think he said any country, but will not allow their sites to be used in order to conduct operations against any other country. So, of course, that's a statement in peacetime. Who knows what would really happen in wartime? But I think that direct participation, by the Philippines, very unlikely. Australia is pretty far away, so it might be able to provide some, logistical support or something, allowing the United States to operate certainly from their bases. There are some things that Australia can do, but it's still very limited. This is primarily going to be a U.S. fight, and the role of Japan, as Lonnie said, will be crucial.
Did you have comments to make?
Sure. I mean, I agree with Lonnie and Bonnie, and I commend Lonnie's paper that he mentioned. The one thing that I would add is my own struggle with blockade scenarios, which is that I look at this primarily as China's political objectives if it were to embark on this course of action. And its political objective is to fly the PRC's flag above Taiwan's presidential office and to rule Taiwan indefinitely into the future. And so if that is your political objective, I'm not sure how you get there with a blockade, because you're basically saying, well, I'm going to starve out Taiwan's people so that they come to the negotiating table or surrender. But I think that will take a lot of time to happen if it does occur, and that gives us time to, move our forces into the region. It gives us time to assemble an international coalition and impose sanctions on China and make all of this hurt a lot more on the punishment side. So if Beijing embarks on this course and is committed to achieving unification, then I think that it is in Beijing's interest to do it in as fast of a manner as possible, which is why, and I think Lonnie might have alluded to this in his earlier remarks, why I think it would be an invasion plus a blockade plus X, and it would be, you know, strikes on Taiwan at the outset of a conflict to try to take out critical infrastructure, command and control, and things of that nature. So I think that I personally have trouble with a blockade and isolation of all these other things, because if I'm in Beijing, I want to do this as quickly as possible so that the United States doesn't have the ability to come to Taiwan's defense.
Great, thank you very much.
One last comment.
Please.
I agree with that, but if the invasion fails, blockade's all they got left. And at that point, it's either they lose or they do the blockade.
Okay, great. In the back there, there's someone raised their hand. Lady there, please.
Hi, I'm from Taiwan and I'm a GW student. I'm now interning in Project 2049. My question is for Dr. Hanley. Do you think that Xi Jinping is deterrable? And do you think US have capability to deter CCP? This is my question. Thank you.
My central thesis is that Chinese leaders, including Xi, are amply deterred, but the deterrence is not sufficient. So then you get into semantic debate about what do you mean by deterrable.
Okay, gentleman over here in the white shirt.
Richard Coleman, CBP retired. On your thesis that we should promote the continued Chinese hope that nonviolent means would be worth holding those cards, should the U.S. in the coming election actually be rooting for the Kuomintang to?
I guess that's for you, Lonnie.
It's not so much a question of who's in office. It's a question of how leaders in Taiwan and in the United States phrase things. So we want China to continue in its mistaken belief that peaceful unification is possible. Peaceful as they define it. I don't mean nice. I don't mean non-coercive. I just mean non-violent. And if they believe it's possible, then they prefer that course of action. When we say things like Taiwan is a vital strategic geopolitical position, vital to U.S. national security interests, what they hear us say is, you know, we are never, ever, ever getting back together, with apologies to Taylor Swift. And that's not the message we should be conveying. When we say we want strategic clarity, but we don't mean that we are opposed to peaceful reunification, they don't hear the second half of that. They hear the first half of that, that we will defend Taiwan, and paren, we will not let you ever have Taiwan under any circumstances, even peaceful circumstances. We should never convey that message. I'm in favor of doing, you know, lead them along, you know, make friendly sounding noises from both Washington and Beijing, Washington and Taipei on this subject, while continuing to make very serious military preparations, more serious than we've done so far, because we're not addressing the blockade.
Okay.
I add something short to that.
For everybody, yes.
The United States in prior administrations, I think a core element of our statements that comprise our One China policy has been that the United States will not oppose any outcome that is negotiated peacefully between the two sides of the strait. And that statement has not been made publicly by the Biden administration. And I question U.S. officials about this all the time, and I still have not gotten what I think is a really good answer. But I think that this is important, so I agree with Lonnie's central point here, that the failure of the United States to try to leave the door open to a peaceful resolution, to stick with our what has been our traditional approach, that we care about process, not about outcome, I think is central to deterrence. This becomes even more important as, for other reasons that are beyond our control, like public opinion polls in Taiwan, are leading the PRC to be less and less confident that they could ever achieve peaceful unification. So I think that there are things that the Biden administration should say. We have not said we would support unification if it was negotiated between the two sides of the strait. I personally don't think that that is something that the administration has to say, that could be considered. The important statement is that any outcome that is peacefully negotiated, and we usually say, at least in this administration, with the assent of the 23 million people on Taiwan. In the Bush administration, that was with the assent of people on both sides of the strait. But of course, they don't get a vote. Thanks.
So I actually think that we've done quite a bit of reassuring Beijing on this question. I mean, Secretary Blinken, when he was in Beijing, said we do not support Taiwan independence. President Biden has communicated that privately to Xi Jinping, I believe, as well. And other officials have said that. And so, but what I have trouble with is that if you map these reassurances against PRC actions, it's unclear to me that there's any linkage. And so if you look at how the PRC continues to try to change the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, it's on a trajectory that is uninterrupted or unchanged by reassurances that the United States has offered. And so we can continue to reassure China in whatever way, you know, we can think of it. But in my view, they're happy to pocket the reassurances and say, okay, well, now your deeds have to match your words because you don't really mean what you say. And so prove to us that you really mean it, which gets into thornier questions of whether then you're in favor of limiting arms sales to Taiwan, putting a cap on US-Taiwan interactions politically, you know, diplomatically, economically, or in the military realm, and what you're willing to sacrifice essentially to reassure Beijing and what that gets us as a result of that. So again, I'm not really sure what these reassurances get us.
Time for one more question. The gentleman with the blue shirt there.
Thank you so much. My name is Kensuke Abe from Marubeni Corporation, Japanese private company. So my question is for David. So you mentioned the U.S. cannot defend Taiwan without Japanese involvement. So do you think the U.S. government should seek to the Japanese clear strategy or clear commitment or statement about the Taiwan issue?
Well, I think that Japan has actually been quite clear on this, to the extent that Japan can be clear given its post-war constitution and things of that nature. I mean, you had former Prime Minister Abe saying that a Taiwan emergency is an emergency for the U.S.-Japan alliance. Again, references to Taiwan have worked their way into joint statements between Biden and Suga, and then Biden and Kishida. Japan's defense white paper has also made clear references to Taiwan, and I think that if you look at Japanese actions, they're quite clear. But in terms of whether Japan should definitively state what it would do, you know, I think that I'm empathetic to Japan's perspective, or what I hear, which is, listen, if the United States isn't going to say clearly what it's going to do, why should we say it? And so, again, I don't want to necessarily link it all back to this question of strategic ambiguity or clarity, but I do think it's unfair to ask our allies to be clearer than we are on this question. But privately, as Bonnie noted, we are having these conversations about roles and responsibilities. To me, the biggest question is the time element. And that is that if there is a sense in the United States that an invasion or a blockade is imminent, or China is moving in that direction, we are going to want pretty much unfettered access in a very timely way. But Japan, again, given its post-war constitution, we have to have, and our alliance, we have to have prior consultations on this question. The prime minister might want to bring this up in the Diet and talk to the public about it. And so, my concern here is that basically Japan seeks to have a very consultative process, and we basically say, okay, we need to move now. And that's an issue to me for the alliance.
Great, thank you all very much. Anybody have any final comments on the panel here? All set. I had one idea that I'm just personally wrestling with, and it's Xi Jinping calculating that Taiwan is inexorably moving toward status that will prevent reunification peacefully, and therefore will have to move forcefully. And the identity in Taiwan continues to move in that direction, the people's identity, but the voting pattern doesn't. They keep voting for the KMT and in island-wide elections. They did that in 2018. They did it recently, and so this is and of course the pattern over the last 20 years is very different. And so this is something I'm wrestling with. I don't. In other words, they landslide for Ma Ying-jeou, re-elect Ma Ying-jeou, and then landslide for Tsai Ing-wen. And Ma Ying-jeou came after Chen Shui-bian. Chen Shui-bian won the re-election in 2006. So it's all sort of, it's still a contention. That's reassuring, I guess, from Beijing's perspective, that Taiwan won't inevitably move in this direction at this time.
I just want to highlight the public opinion poll that's been conducted in Taiwan since 1992 about people are given the question, would you support independence now or at some point in the future, reunification now at some point in the future, or the preservation of the status quo? And although the percentage supporting reunification has declined and the percentage supporting independence in the future has increased, more than 50% continue to say that they support the status quo. And to me, that tells me that people of Taiwan are really smart. They understand that taking provocative actions to change the status quo would be really detrimental to their ability to preserve the freedoms that they have. And so regardless of who they vote for, I think there still remains a lot of support for the preservation of the status quo. To me, that's really reassuring.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Well, I think that it's really a very, very candid conversation about the Taiwan security situation. But let me get back to the the effective deterrence. I think sometimes at somewhat degree, I think terminology plays a critical role in terms of effective deterrence. Back to the point about the U.S. longstanding position towards the Taiwan Strait, I think peaceful unification is not a way, to be acceptable in Taiwan. You look at the polling that Bonnie mentioned that even though Taiwan democracy is pretty robust, as you can see, we have four-way race right now in our presidential election. There are different views about the future with China, but look at the different kinds of pollings. I think most people in Taiwan favor status quo. Yeah, I think that's the bottom line. And I think in that regard, I think the continuity of U.S. policy towards Taiwan is important when it comes to the terminology like peaceful resolution instead of peaceful unification. Yeah, because you use a different terminology, many different things, and peaceful unification probably might trigger another political pendulum to another side of political spectrum. And I mean, this kind of stability in Taiwan public opinion, I think can be a credit to continuity of U.S. policy towards Taiwan. So this is my short comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we'll conclude on that note, and please join me in thanking the panel for a wonderful presentation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back for the second half of the show today. And as we were having a sidebar conversation, you can expect it to be a little bit happier, perhaps. No bombings, no threats, and so forth. So welcome. Okay. All right, I hope you're all feeling energized after the lunch. And I'm just delighted because we have for you this afternoon, looking at the economic and building resiliency of Taiwan as the main theme this afternoon, which is kind of the flip side of the security element that Taiwan has to worry about as well. And for that, we have three outstanding speakers, I'm happy to say, old friends and a new one as well. So, you know, what we heard this morning was the kind of options that all countries, including US and allies, have to exercise and think about when we think about peace and security across the Taiwan Strait. The economic side of it and increasingly the notion of economic security is becoming extremely important. And how do you protect that? And the idea of building partnerships for resiliency, I think the word resiliency is extremely important because we're not just talking about increasing trade, increasing investment, it really is something qualitatively more under the more competitive strategic environment where you now have to worry about resiliency. How do you withstand pressure, coercion in other spheres as well? So I'm going to start off with Shihiko Goto, who will be talking to us about Indo-Pacific partnerships, which are very important. We already heard about some of the partnerships, but she's going to talk about this in a more political economy way. And she's come well prepared for this, given her own background, which is Director for Geoeconomics and Indo-Pacific Enterprise at the Wilson Center. And geoeconomics really captures the tone here. She's a financial journalist in the past, and she's covered a variety of international political economy with a focus on Asian markets. She continues to write for various magazines, a very important one like The Diplomat. And she has a degree from Trinity College, Oxford, UK. Following her will be Adnan Rasul to her left, who is the Hardy Graham Distinguished Faculty Assistant Professor of Political Science all the way from University of Tennessee. And so it was wonderful to find Dr. Rasul. He is one of the few who have done some very interesting work on small states and their smart diplomacy in political economy situations. And he's done a beautiful comparison with Taiwan and countries like Singapore that we all know, we all want to be, other countries want to be like Singapore. How do they do that? So, and he's written widely on these subjects, and he's also a former Taiwan fellow. So he has special expertise from that angle. And last, and certainly not least, is our friend Barbara Wiesel, who is a managing director at Rock Creek Global Advisors. And so we have kind of a more private sector perspective. However, she's also comes with 25 years of experience in government, and especially, again, focusing on Asia Pacific. She served most recently as Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And she was the chief negotiator for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I know that that was a thankless job. That was just very, very difficult, but kudos to you for that. And I just want to say that she also has been negotiating, a chief negotiator of free trade agreements, United States with Malaysia, Thailand, Australia, Singapore. So she has also 2 master's degrees from Harvard University. So let me say that, I'm really looking forward to afternoon session because we're going to get a bunch of different views and maybe balance out what we heard in the morning. So let me start off with Shihoko, and you can sit there or stand up here, whatever you like.
Thank you so much, Deepa. And thank you all so much for staying after a delicious lunch. It's always difficult to provide entertainment after good food, but hopefully we will succeed in this endeavor. Let me start by stating the obvious, which is to say that Taiwan's strategic importance to the Indo-Pacific has always been apparent in Northeast Asia. Taiwan's geographic proximity, its economic success, and its leadership in advanced technology all have made clear to neighboring countries such as Japan and Korea that having a Taiwan that continues to thrive and to be stable and be stable and to have stable cross-strait relations are not just in the interest of Taiwan itself, but for the security and prosperity of the region at large as well. But at the same time, there's been a lack of urgency to support Taipei in pushing back against some of the threats that it is facing in achieving continued prosperity, and that is really coming from China's unwavering ambitions towards Taiwan. That position, however, has obviously changed. There is recognition beyond Taiwan's immediate neighbors and even beyond the Indo-Pacific about Taiwan's strategic importance, as well as its vulnerabilities that actually require international support. And supporting Taiwan publicly, coordinating efforts to support Taiwan's economy and its political and military interests have taken on a greater sense of urgency, especially as China is taking an increasingly hardline stance across the board, including, but certainly not limited to Taiwan. And of course, Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine has really opened the global community's eyes to the actions that authoritarian regimes might take. In light of these realities, there have been 3 notable developments that have really anchored the development of partnerships to enhance Taiwan's resiliency to external pressures. The first one is that supporting Taiwan has become a shared value in itself for governments rallying for a rules-based order. And for Japan in particular, Japan has always had very close relations with Taiwan, both in the public as well as private sectors. There have been Japanese parliamentary exchanges to Taiwan, a great deal of two-way investment between the governments, tourism, cultural exchange, you name it. It's been a very strong and healthy relationship. But like the United States, Japan has officially had an ambiguous position on Taiwan, and it's been even more reluctant than the United States to openly criticize China and its coercive actions towards Taipei. And Tokyo has shied away from making any decisive public commitments to Taiwan. And there have, of course, been and continues to be domestic constitutional constraints on deploying forces overseas. And that has been an obstacle for Japan declaring publicly great support for Taiwan. The turning point has been, as Bonnie said in the morning session, what came in April 2021, when Suga Yoshihide met with President Biden, and at the conclusion of their summit, they stated the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. And this was, of course, the first time that such a statement was made by the 2 countries publicly since 1969. But it also became this opportunity for Japan to parlay some of its rhetoric about its commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific onto paper. Supporting Taiwan became a broader agenda for Japan to maintain a rules-based order. And I would argue that the idea of having an Indo-Pacific strategy by Japan or by the United States or many European countries, that in itself has become essentially a code word for a China strategy. It also for Japan politically too, having the successor to Prime Minister Abe, both Prime Minister Suga and Prime Minister Kishida continuing to support Taiwan, has been this ability for Japan to say that its role as a global to be a global statesman, to have a significant role in the international order and maintaining the international stability, has gone beyond simply focusing on one prime minister, and it has become this national agenda as well. And the statement that was released in April 2021 actually became the basis of the subsequent statements that have come from the international community to support Taiwan. Of course, we had the statement by President Moon Jae-in and President Biden a couple of months after that. And then we also had the G7 statement essentially echoing what Japan has, the US-Japan bilateral statement had stated in supporting Taiwan. So over the last 2 years, it has come from this extraordinary development, open support for Taiwan, becoming headline news unto itself. And rapidly over the past 24 months, it's become almost pedestrian, that it's almost become an expected part of international statements, international commitments to demonstrate that kind of commitment to Taiwan, at least in word, if not in deed. The second point, the second development that is noteworthy is that Taiwan itself has become a force unifier insofar as it's been able to bring like-minded countries together, or actually focus on some of the common issues and challenges that they face. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there have been growing fears about the risks of authoritarian rule, and the fear about the implications of Beijing's claims to Taiwan actually leading to action have alarmed the international community. And there has become a clear shared goal amongst advanced economies to avoid cross-strait conflict in the first place, which is to say bringing like-minded countries closer together with shared interests, uniting them to protect the status quo across the region, including in the Taiwan Strait. And I want to say it's status quo, not just between China and Taiwan, but it is status quo across the region. And this is what the free and open Indo-Pacific vision actually is. And we also see that the shared interest has brought together former, not necessarily foes, but countries that have actually had very testy relations over in the recent past more closely together. And we see that with the trilateral between the United States, Japan, and Korea at Camp David last month. It brought Japan and Korea together with the United States. And of course, the process of improved ties between Tokyo and Seoul is another forum unto itself. But it is striking that wariness about Chinese intentions towards Taiwan has become this factor that is uniting the three countries. And it has enhanced also Korea's commitment to aligning more with the United States and Japan in promoting the status quo. and there is greater expectation for coordination against coercion. The third development that we see is that the situation in Taiwan has pushed the boundaries of Northeast Asia's commitments for regional stability beyond their own borders. So yes, the United States continues to lead when it comes to regional defense and providing military security, but there are, as we heard in the first panel, greater expectations for Japanese military engagement, not just from the United States, but also from Taiwan as well. And Japan has made clear in its latest national security strategy that Taiwan is of strategic importance for Japan's own interest. As it states, peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is an indispensable element for the security and prosperity of the international community. And it goes on to say that Taiwan is an extremely important partner and a precious friend of Japan, with whom Japan shares fundamental values, including democracy, and has close economic and personal ties. This has opened up a can of worms, though, in Japan. The sentiment may actually be shared from the grassroots level to the Japanese leadership, but there are risks involved as well. And there is continued pushback amongst the Japanese public about what this friendship and close partnership and commitment to Taiwan would actually mean as Japan grapples with its own broader defense strategy as it looks to double its defense spending and deal with some of the risks that it is facing in the region. When it comes to Korea, South Korea has traditionally focused on the Korean Peninsula, but what we have seen is that under the Yoon administration, there is a clamoring for a more proactive Korea and greater Korean commitment to security and stability in the region. And it's worth noting that Korea actually released its own Indo-Pacific strategy late last year. The fact that it has released an Indo-Pacific strategy demonstrates the fact that Korea is in line with the United States and its allies and partners, including Japan, and being prepared to take a firmer stance when it comes to pushing back against China. And Yoon himself has said in an interview that the Taiwan issue is not simply an issue between China and Taiwan, but like the issue of North Korea, it is a global issue. Now, all of this is good and well, and I think there is a common baseline understanding that the threat that Taiwan is facing is real, and that Taiwan does need the support of the international community, and that the interest of Taiwan to ensure the status quo is in the interest of the international community as well. But how does this actually translate into action? On the economic front, it actually hasn't translated into much demonstrable action or even a roadmap. So there should be, I would argue, there's this prime opportunity for the international community to come up with an economic roadmap to enhance Taiwan's economic resilience towards Chinese coercion and offer greater economic security to Taiwan as well. But there are one way that we could see that is through the CPTPP, and I know Barbara will be talking more about this. But of course, Taiwan made the bid about exactly 2 years ago to join the CPTPP, and Taipei continues to push hard on entering the ambitious trade framework, which of course the United States is not part of, and Korea's accession would actually be after that of Taiwan, given the order that the application was made. But that said, some would argue that Taiwan has succeeded in flourishing as an economy, as a global leader in technology in particular, without being part of any significant major trade agreement. So why does it need to be part of the CPTPP? Of course, the reality of the global trade regimes is changing. And we have seen not just CPTPP, but also the emergence of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which China is part of and the United States is not. But with the CPTPP, with RCEP, there are mechanisms for greater regional economic integration. With Taiwan being outside of both, it runs the risk of being an outlier from some of the efficiencies that would be created by these two trade agreements. But perhaps more importantly, it thwarts the opportunity to strengthen Taiwan's position in the international order. This is a unique chance for Taiwan to be able, not only for Taiwan to be part of a major international trade framework, but also for the international community to come to the support of Taiwan's economy, and at the same time, its bid to have a firmer ground in enhancing its international status. There is a divide amongst the member countries of CPTPP, those that are actively supporting Taiwan and others less so. But there is a line between supporting China succession ahead of Taiwan. And there is a clear divide as to which countries would actually welcome the accession of China, and the ramifications of that for Taiwan would be to essentially keep Taiwan out of CPTPP. The second trade framework, of course, is the one that the United States is leading. That is to say, the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. There was a great deal of disappointment initially in Taiwan for not being one of the initial 14 member countries of IPEF, but the fact that the United States has been able to develop a U.S.-Taiwan initiative on 21st century trade has softened some of that blow. And the fact that the 21st century trade agreement is actually making steady progress and has actually been passed in an otherwise a very divided Congress, which is hesitant to take on new trade agreements, can be seen as encouraging to some extent. But perhaps what is what troubles me in particular is the lack of appetite from Taiwan's allies, including Japan and Korea, to move forward with similar bilateral trade agreements. These could be low-hanging fruits. Things like trade facilitation and custom administration are issues that other countries could also push for in enhancing economic ties with Taiwan. By doing so, they would not only have closer economic relations with Taiwan, but it would also lead to a strengthening of Taiwan's economic position in the global community. And it would also provide domestic support for Taiwan's leadership at a time when there is a lot of pressure for Taiwan and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of a form of existential crisis in trying to reconcile the fact that it is facing a number of fundamental challenges to its economy. So having a similar 21st century trade agreement by other like-minded countries would actually be to the support of Taiwan, but that is seen to be unlikely. The risks politically at home in countries like Japan and Korea are too high at the moment. There is also the fear of backlash from China, and Beijing's response and the coercion that could come with it have staved off such moves to support Taiwan economically at the moment. And so the economic support for Taiwan is a ripe occasion. This is the ripe occasion to provide greater support, but it is still some ways to go for that to actually materialize. So let me stop here. Thanks.
Hello? Yes, it's working. Thank you so much, Yuhiko, for giving us the regional viewpoint on Indo-Pacific partnerships, which we don't really hear. We're so focused on the Washington that we don't get enough of the views from Japan and South Korea. And it is a bit surprising that it seems to be there's a little mismatch between Japan's strategic seemingly greater convergence with Taiwan, but economically that there's still a long way to go. So having heard from the two important countries and their views in the region, I now want to turn to Taiwan itself, and then I'll turn to the United States with Barbara. So Adnan has done some very good work on the new southbound policy of Taiwan, because the other part of this is how is Taiwan trying to integrate, make itself more attractive for other partners? Because it's not just a one-way street. And he has done some intensive research into this. So over to you.
Thank you, Deepa. So far, what we have heard is mostly been focused from outside looking in. What can we do in DC and different capitals around the world to help Taiwan? What I am presenting today and the discussion that I'm putting forth is what Taiwan has been doing for the last many, many years in order to establish its own security, not in the traditional sense, but in a non-traditional sense. What Taiwan has done in terms of diplomacy and using its diplomatic efforts. And I will talk about how that has been fairly successful, more so than we realize, in allowing Taiwan to achieve a core diplomatic objective that it set out for itself, which was to have and maintain a unique identity that is not envisioned within the idea of People's Republic of China, to be unique, to be its own self, and how that has panned out for Taiwan over the last few years. So I'll be talking about that. Initially, I'm going to start out discussing the idea of how expensive it was and has been for Taiwan to get involved in traditional diplomacy, where they have a few allies around the world and the cost of doing so. I would also like to talk about how Taiwan shifted and pivoted away towards smart diplomacy and the concept of smart diplomacy, and how that has panned out in terms of the new southbound policy, which was first introduced after President Tsai came into power. And then I'll continue from there. So to start out, exactly the question that Taiwan faces itself every day is, what is the value proposition Taiwan is presenting to the rest of the world? Why should everyone else be concerned about Taiwan? Why is defending Taiwan worth everybody's time and effort? And the answer to that has taken a while for Taiwan to put together, but it is a very coherent answer. That answer being, there is no way any of us in this room can survive and live our lives if it weren't for Taiwan. And you may wonder why. Well, the microchips in all of our phones, our laptops, even the basic equipment like the projector screens, parts of these originate from Taiwan. Without TSMC or without Foxconn, we wouldn't be sitting here doing what we're doing and living our lives. So it's not that Taiwan has something to show for itself. No, Taiwan already exists in our lives. It's just the packaging of that message that has evolved over a period of time and directly as a result of the new southbound policy and how to explain to people that we are the people that are making your lives possible. Taiwan is not important because it's our last stand against China. Taiwan is critical because without Taiwan, you would not be living the quality of life that you're living. And that's a significant change in how Taiwan envisions itself as well. So the idea of smart diplomacy in that sense is how Taiwan looks at itself and leans on what it's really, really good at, has expertise in, which is having a very good economy, technical expertise in things like education, in healthcare, in technology, as well as taxation, and then leaning really hard on those and expanding those efforts into a part of the region that we haven't talked about much today, which is Southeast Asia. We have focused a lot on Northeast Asia. We've talked about North Asia. What we have not talked about is the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific, which is Southeast Asia and India. And that is where the new southbound policy has been fixated on and has been focused on. The idea is not new. This was an idea that originally President Lee Teng-hui came up with when he came up with the Go South policy. This was something President Chen Shui-bian also focused on early on in his first term before he was scuttled in his second term for multiple reasons. But this is something that President Tsai has seen and understood as a necessity for Taiwan in order to move away from traditional levels of diplomacy. So the idea being we maintain a unique identity for Taiwan, which does not require us paying huge amounts of money and our allies holding us hostage in order for allowing us to have diplomatic recognition. If we take diplomatic recognition off the table, we allow people to work by the 92 consensus and allow them to live by their one China policies. What can Taiwan bring to the world and what can the world do for Taiwan? And in that case, the value proposition is we are the friend that you did not know you needed. Hands down, Taiwan has better technical knowledge and understanding of tech, healthcare, supply chains. The global supply chain sustainability depends very heavily on Taiwan. A lot of the time in these discussions, we fail to mention the fact that Foxconn's majority production facilities are based in China. The only country that has consistent experience of working with China and understanding how regulations have evolved and continue to evolve in China is Taiwan, more than everyone else. They have been investing money in mainland China since 1980s, originally when Deng Xiaoping started opening up through economic reforms. So Taiwan has a lot to offer, not just in terms of what they technically understand, but their relationship with the Chinese. For a lot of countries in Southeast Asia who are reluctant to become pawns in the great power competition, they're neither here or there. They're interested in making money. And Taiwan offers them the value proposition of, hey, we've been working with the Chinese for a very long period of time, as well as the Americans. Do you guys want us to come help you and assist you, try to understand exactly how to balance these things? And that's where they're finding an opening for themselves. Countries like India, countries like Indonesia have not only invested a heavy amount of money in their relationship, but they have invested a heavy amount of people or people-to-people contact in terms of helping Taiwan. What we've also not discussed so far, which is a critical moment in Taiwan's demography, is Taiwan's population is also shrinking. So Taiwan is more and more reliant on workers coming in from Southeast Asian countries, specifically countries like Indonesia, where about 5 years ago, the total number of Indonesian workers working in Taiwan was closer to about 145,000 people. Right now, it's pushing about 250,000 people. Taiwanese universities were never the ones to go out there and aggressively recruit international students. Taiwanese government just announced a few months ago that they were going to actively recruit 10,000 students from Southeast Asia, particularly. Then there are programs like Taiwan Fellowship and scholarships at the national level. So what Taiwan has done is it's created a value proposition for all of these people in Southeast Asia, and by people, I mean specifically countries, that listen, we completely understand that you cannot open up an embassy in our country, but here's the thing, we can offer you these benefits of a steady relationship with us. And that has a direct impact on how Taiwan earns its security and earns trust from all of these allies. Yes, if we were to go to war, theoretically, none of these allies would take its side. But the fact is, these allies have an economic impact on the global economy as well. These allies are allowing Taiwan to further consolidate its unique identity for what it is. And again, I go back to the original statement that I made. Taiwan is a friend you didn't know you needed is something that I've heard throughout my field work in Taiwan since 2017. Whether it was at the National Security Council, whether it was in individual interviews, the one thing repeatedly being, we just want to be the friend countries did not know that they needed. And the way Taiwan has been embedded in the global supply chain and the way things have worked out for Taiwan, it's very difficult to take Taiwan out of that supply chain, whether it's Foxconn, whether it's TSMC, whether it is providing technical assistance on how to set up mass transit systems or taxation systems. For instance, in countries like Indonesia, as well as countries like Philippines, Taiwanese have been influential in setting up taxation systems, providing them technical assistance. Things like this make a huge difference in that region. And as the population declines in Taiwan, more and more people are going to be required to come to Taiwan as immigrants and as guest workers and help the economy stay afloat. So at that stage, Southeast Asia is invested in Taiwan, not in terms of we should probably protect these values, which is critical, but also in terms of, well, a huge chunk of their population makes money over there. It makes sense to protect this country, not because it's a country that needs protection. No, because it's embedded into our economy, it's embedded into our value systems and so on and so forth. And I would like to end by saying that as far as Taiwan's understanding of things is concerned, Taiwan views itself as a country. It may not be enjoying the same diplomatic benefits of being a country, but realize they don't have international organizations or even regional organizations to leverage to establish themselves as a useful partner. And they're going at alone when it comes to things like New Southbound policy. And that's been very, very successful. It's a point of hope how Taiwan has been expanding and doing so. The best expectation that the Taiwanese have from everybody else, and clearly India has shown more willingness to help them, and as well as Indonesia, is to continue this people-to-people progress, continue to have these discussions, continue to mainstream the idea that Taiwan is the partner that you need and Taiwan is the partner that is critical, because this is the very limited prospect of diplomacy smaller states have. Singapore made a name of itself based on exactly these ideals. Their niche was very different from what Taiwan is good at, but these are the limited options smaller states have. Take into account countries like Qatar, countries like UAE in the Middle East, all of them have chosen one or two things to specialize in. In the case of Taiwan, that seems to be procedures, systems, technology, and healthcare. And that's the value proposition Taiwan continues to present in a positive manner, that we're so essential that you need us more than you know. And with that, thank you.
Thank you so much. I think the branding of Taiwan in many ways is a very successful case of countries' soft power, and convincing other countries that it is a friend that you didn't know you need is a great way of advertising for Taiwan. All right, well, Taiwan's niche diplomacy, I think, has been commented on very nicely by you, and we'll come back to some of this. But let me now turn to the last word from Barbara Wiesel, who's going to talk and return us to Washington for a few minutes. And given her background, I think we'll get some inside stories as well, perhaps. Thank you, Barbara.
Thanks, and thanks to the Elliott School, and thanks Deepa for inviting me. I really enjoyed the presentations this morning and the presentations by my fellow panelists. So thanks again. And I am the only one who did a PowerPoint. Usually I'm the only one who doesn't do a PowerPoint, but at this point in the afternoon, you probably all appreciate something that's going to keep you awake. So let me get started. Okay, I'm gonna be very clear about what I'm talking about here. I'm gonna start with U.S. trade and investment flows. and just sort of an overview of what's going on there, and then talk about existing initiatives that are have been established between the US and Taiwan on trade specifically, and then move to the economic security dialogues, which are distinct from those on the trade side. And then I'll give you some thoughts to start the discussion, and we can continue from there. All right, I thought a good place to start would be to give you a picture of the current trade relationship. And it is already significant. We're important trading partners to to each other, and it is continuing to expand. So US exports to Taiwan grew from 24 billion in 2012, and 10 years later to 44 billion. And they are on track to maintain that level this year, according to the data through July. So, continued robust growth. US imports from Taiwan grew from 39 billion in 2012 to 92 billion last year, and also is on track to match that level. We'll see that that's quite a large trade deficit, which, you see the balance numbers rising in favor of Taiwan, which in this administration is not a problem, but was in the last administration, and maybe again. The US was Taiwan's second largest goods trading partner after China, and second largest export market, and third largest source of imports. So again, a very important partner. And Taiwan was the US's 10th largest trading partner and 8th largest source of imports last year. Although I have to say, in the data from just this year, they've moved up again to number 8. They've gone up and down around number 8, 9, 10 for several years, but they are at 8 for so far this year. And, in terms of the composition of trade, we've talked a bit about this before, no surprise. Computers, computer parts, chips, electrical equipment, cell phones are top imports to the United States from Taiwan, and the US sells to Taiwan oil and gas, semiconductor tools, aircraft and parts and chemicals, and also is a significant services export market. And I think a very important thing to remember is that it is a very important agricultural market, which is important for our in the political scene here in the US. On investment flows, Taiwan's a growing source of FDI in the United States. Although the majority of its FDI still flows to China, it has declined a bit this year, 4% so far this year compared to the same period last year, according to Taiwan's Investment Commission. And the increases seem to have gone to the United States and other countries in Asia, new southbound policy. Taiwan's FDI in the United States is focused on advanced technologies, all of these same sectors as we're trading in. And, of course, the big announcement last December about TSMC's new factory in Arizona, and then the expansion of that factory, I think really were the highlights of the investment relationship over the last year, and really put Taiwan in the headlines on this issue. I just want to step back for a minute to talk about how to think about the US-Taiwan relationship in the context of the trade agenda of the United States. Again, distinct from the economic security, just the economic and trade agenda. So early on in the administration, Jake Sullivan articulated these elements here on the slide as the international economic policy goals the administration had set to address the challenges we face. And some of our trading partners have noted that among these 5 items are competing objectives, and have experienced the fact that they're competing objectives. For example, we want to have a modern American industrial policy, and that includes the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act and the elements in there that affect foreign countries. But we also want to work with allies and partners. And we want to establish the importance of rebuilding those relationships, notwithstanding the impact of these industrial policies on them, and that many of them see as hurting their interests. So the administration often has to figure out how it's going to reconcile these competing interests. The administration, I think, is pursuing a trade agenda that's very distinct from any of the previous administrations, including the Trump administration. But one thing that it did shortly after coming into office was resuming the trade and investment framework agreement discussions that had gone on for many, many years before the Trump administration. And the TIFA, as we call these, are regular bilateral discussions that go on between countries to discuss, the elements that I have here, bilateral irritants, to try to address things in the relationship and keep it on track, but also to coordinate on broader issues. That group met for many years to try to deal with all of the bilateral issues that exist between us and to build trust and confidence in the trading relationship. It did not meet during the Trump administration. So they resumed right away, and I think that gave a lot of people the sense that we were headed toward a free trade agreement and negotiations. And I try to remind people that a TIFA is not a stepping stone to a free trade agreement. It is really a dialogue intended to discuss bilateral issues and to coordinate. But somewhere along the line, people started thinking about it as a stepping stone. It is not one. And the administration did not resume it as though it was a stepping stone to a bilateral FTA. Work on the TIFA has stopped because of other initiatives, and there are many bilateral issues that remain between us. And we sometimes paper over these because we think of the importance of the overall relationship, but there actually are quite a few bilateral issues between us. Taiwan will hear all about these in the WTO in early November when they have their regular trade policy review and countries get to critique the trade policies of other member states. And so they will be hearing more all about these concerns. As the administration was beginning these TIFA discussions, they were also working to develop their so-called worker-centric trade policy. The administration has never actually clearly articulated what they see as the specific elements of a worker-centric trade policy, but based on the various statements and actions that they've taken, one could provide a list of some of the things that are part of what seems to be part of their definition of worker-centric trade policy. So as you look at some of these elements, you will see them reflected in all of the initiatives that the United States is pursuing. There's a lot of focus on forced and child labor, on including labor issues and supply chains in trade agreements, and an inclusive process generally that includes underrepresented groups, and then discussions on subsidies and competition issues, and separately on reining in big tech, where the administration has concerns about the way that big tech has operated. And so this is sort of in the background of the way that the U.S. is thinking about trade policy as it begins thinking about new trade agreements with other countries. The United States then went ahead and announced the launch of this 21st century trade agreement, already raised, that reflects this worker-centric and broader approach to trade. They see this as a template for other negotiations, and I think initially had expected this negotiation to move quite quickly. but it hasn't moved as fast as they had anticipated. Like the other trade initiatives the administration is pursuing, there is no market access. That is to say, there are no tariffs on the table. There is no services or investment liberalization or government procurement liberalization on the table. What it is negotiating instead is a series of other issues. Some of them are in this first 5 set of issues that the administration concluded negotiation with Taiwan in May. And these are issues that may help support trade. They are relatively easy to negotiate because they're not that different than the way countries already operate and are generally softer types of obligations. But they finished this negotiation and packaged it into an initial agreement that they called actually phase 1, not tranche 1. And they are now respectively confirming that they have made all the changes they need to make in their law to bring this into force. They are now continuing to negotiate the other issues that are a part of the full 21st century trade agreement package. And these include, again, issues that the U.S. thinks as worker-centric in its approach to that, as well as several other issues. And these are much, much more challenging issues to negotiate than the ones that have already been concluded. They are issues that get at the sensitivities and priorities of both sides and include, in some cases, commitments that aren't in previous trade agreements. So a lot of times we take the last generation of trade agreements and we update it a little. There are some issues here that are different than we have had in other trade agreements, including non-market policies. So this is going to be complex. Beyond questions, so that while this negotiation is going on, I think that there are questions about how this agreement will work with IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that the United States is negotiating with 13 other countries, the one that Taiwan ultimately was not invited to join because of reluctance of a lot of other countries to including Taiwan in the agreement. I think there was this sense that there would be this dotted line between this 21st century trade agreement and IPEF because there's a lot of overlap between the agreements, but that has not been clarified, and exactly what the relationship between these two agreements will be remains to be seen. I did want to mention the congressional reaction to the conclusion of the first part of the 21st century trade agreement, because it reminds us that while we think of the bigger interests that we have in common in negotiating these agreements, so everybody will understand that and this will move very quickly, that's not the case. That there are always interests, there are sensitivities and politics involved in negotiating these trade agreements that can come into play even when you don't expect them. So here's an agreement that Congress certainly supported. And there has been very broad bipartisan support on the Hill for negotiating agreements, economic agreements with Taiwan, and they've even called for negotiation of a full FTA. But when the administration announced that it had concluded this negotiation, it started a congressional executive jurisdictional battle. That is quite apart from the agreement. And this has been complicated. Ultimately, Congress passed legislation that confirmed its support for this initial agreement, but it imposed all kinds of consultation and transparency requirements and said that the second part of the agreement, future agreements, the second part and any other future agreements can't take effect without congressional approval. And the administration came back and said, all right, we're going to sign this legislation, but we have these caveats that we don't agree with what's in the legislation, and it essentially was left open because of the support for an agreement with Taiwan. So again, these politics can complicate efforts to move these agreements forward. Let me turn now to economic security. So separate and apart from these really truly kind of trade-focused economic initiatives are these economic security initiatives. And we have economic security initiatives with a number of countries, and there are a lot of them going on. Many of them seem to overlap, but National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has said that the administration doesn't envision one single initiative that will package all of our initiatives, but they want to take a modular approach because they think that a modular approach will lead to an outcome that is greater than the sum of its parts. It's more flexible and nimbler, and it's preferred by our allies. There are a couple of initiatives that the administration has moved forward with. The first is the Economic Prosperity Partnership Dialogue. This was actually also initially launched in the Trump administration, but it was continued by the Biden administration, led by the State Department on the US side, and on the Taiwan side, the Ministries of Economic Affairs and Science and Technology. And here, these are the issues that they're seeking to discuss. I think the focus, although these were the issues that they announced that they would be working on, and I think are working in some degree on all of these issues, the focus really has been on chip supply chains and trying to align the goals of this group with discussions the US is having on the same issues with Korea and Japan. So there are separate discussions, including on the CHIPS Act International Technology and Security Innovation Fund. This is the $500 million fund to help support development of chip supply chains among our allies. So all of this needs to be coordinated so that the money goes where everybody thinks it needs to go. This is not part of the Chip Fourth initiative that you may have heard about, where the US, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, we're going to get together and work on their supply chains. That hasn't really gotten off the ground yet. This is a separate initiative on which they're talking about supply chains and also talking to some extent about economic coercion and ways to mitigate it. Another initiative that the administration launched at the end of 2021 is a Commerce Department initiative. And this is intended to bolster critical supply chains, but looking more at bolstering supply chains into the United States. Here too, the initial focus is on semiconductors, but there are other priority sectors, 5G, EVs, cybersecurity, renewable energy, and unsurprisingly, these are all kind of linked to Taiwan by the dependence of all of these sectors on sophisticated chips. They were also supposed to take up clean energy and global health and science and technology and a whole long list of other issues, but I think the focus has been on these issues primarily. We have also between us a science and technology cooperation dialogue. And this was initiated in May and includes officials from a whole bunch of agencies under State and Commerce Department, which has NOAA and NIST, and also NIH has been involved. So you can tell by the agencies that are participating around the table, the topics that they're discussing. They have identified 5 areas where they want to focus, and that dialogue has just gotten underway and cooperation is only beginning. So it remains to be seen where this is headed. But there was an announcement about a National Science Foundation and the Taiwan National Science and Technology Council investing $6 million in 6 joint projects for research at U.S. universities on semiconductor design and fabrication. And I think this is all part of the cooperation on science and technology to support development of advanced chips and the supply chain between us. Let me provide some concluding thoughts on the relationship between us and where things are headed on the economic security side. We've seen economic security engagement, economic engagement generally intensifies significantly over the last few years, and certainly during this administration, it's a work in progress. Both sides are seeking to strengthen their trade and investment. They want to strengthen their economic security, enhance their political and geopolitical positioning, and they recognize that each other's are critical partners and that we have an interdependence between us in terms of trying to achieve these goals. So far, the United States has taken the lead in developing the new economic security initiatives that the two economies are pursuing. Even though the engagement has been a priority for both, the United States really has been in the lead in designing the initiatives. And the U.S. wants to continue, building these relationships and these linkages because of the importance of Taiwan to the U.S. as a trading partner, and to support it as a partner in the Indo-Pacific and the broader interest we have in supporting Taiwan in the region. The administration wants to deepen these relationships, but it doesn't want to. It doesn't agree with congressional views on exactly how we should do this. Congress thinks we should be deepening relations because Taiwan's a top trading partner, and because if we do that, it can serve as a model for others. We should do an FTA in order to achieve that. The U.S. is not looking at pursuing FTAs, so it will stick to the 21st Century Trade Agreement, even though it agrees with Congress's view on the importance of strengthening our ties as much as we can. I think Taiwan would prefer an FTA to the 21st Century Trade Agreement, but has accepted that that is not in the cards. This is the best option for now, so they're going to accept it. It wants the agreement for reasons that are similar to those of the United States, and it hopes that having concluded this agreement, it will encourage other countries to negotiate with it. And there's a separate reason, and I actually have not talked about CPTPP, when we can come to that, but one of the other reasons that they want to have this 21st Century Agreement is because in concluding whatever can be construed as a high standard agreement, they can demonstrate to the CPTPP members who are reviewing their application to join that they are well qualified to and positioned to negotiate a high standard trade agreement. In terms of their bid to join CPTPP, and I agree with you on the importance to Taiwan of being part of some of these initiatives, the CPTPP countries actually have made the decision that accession will not be on a conveyor belt basis. So the fact that China and Taiwan put in their request before some of the other countries that are in line is not relevant to the decision of who will go first. And I think that Taiwan is aware of that. The 21st Century Trade Agreement has these various geopolitical benefits. I think the question right now is what the economic benefits will be. And we will have to see the final agreement, the second set of issues, to know whether or not the benefits will be significant, what each side will get out of it, and how the agreement will be enforced. And it remains to be seen how this agreement, as I said, will link to the other initiatives that are going on in the region, because obviously it would be more significant if there were some dotted lines there. On the economic security side, both sides similarly see value in growing the economic security relationship. And actually, this is the real priority for both sides. The U.S., certainly values the economic security partnership with Taiwan, but it's designed the initiatives that it's pursuing with Taiwan to fit within its own domestic and international priorities, not those of other economies, including Taiwan. And Taiwan is itself working with the U.S., but also with other partners as it determines how best to ensure its own resiliency and economic security and its own objectives. So this cooperation across all these different areas is helping the two countries align their interests better, but the situation is not static, and the two sides will need to be agile, they'll need to be creative, and prepared to work in other configurations to deal with the evolving threats and challenges that they face, including from China's indigenization policies, which I think they're all following very closely. So let me stop there. Thank you. You can move on.
All right, I'm happy to say we still have a few minutes left for our discussion. And I wanted to actually, I wanted to leave that one slide with the partnerships and US, if you could, just because, if well, because it sort of brought together the theme of the panel, which was the Indo-Pacific partnerships as well as US-Taiwan. I thought it was really good if you could bring it up. But meanwhile, you know, when you look at Taiwan, it, keep going back. No, forward, right there. Oops. No, back. Where was the Indo-Pacific partnership? Yeah, that's it, right there. Before.
This one? Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
right there. Okay. So just as a backdrop, when you look at Taiwan, Taiwan's, even though, you know, economically, it's a very attractive partner, clearly, but it operates within a very difficult security environment, right? And with the possibility of Chinese pressure on other partners who want to have a closer relations with Taiwan economically. So it seems to me that Taiwan has had to fashion its entirely a different approach to getting its economic objectives between kind of the realistic possibilities versus its aspirational goals. And in this case, I just want to turn to the panel for very quickly to see to what extent this kind of a pushback from China and in the context of greater geopolitical competition, as we saw in the morning between US and China and Chinese coercion increasing, generally speaking, how do you see the partners, Japan and Korea in this case, Shihoko, responding and taking into account that, whereas Taiwan's economic attractiveness is going up, partly because of the fact that the chips are such an important thing, how do they balance that? Do you think that that Japan and Korea are doing a good job on that? And to you, and same question, but how well do you think Taiwan has been integrating that new concern that's become more acute into its own smart? How smart has it been in the very recent past, beyond the new Southbound policy? And I guess for you, Barbara, what I want to see is, what do you think is the biggest challenge? You know, you had lots of, and by the way, those PowerPoints were excellent because there's a lot going on between US and and Taiwan. What would you say, given your past experience as trade negotiator, going to be the most difficult obstacle in terms of economic goals that both have? Okay, so with that, let's start with you.
So when it comes to strategic competition on the economic front, it's quite different from strategic competition on the security front. The competition, Taiwan is actually the competition when it comes to economic interests. So we all know that Taiwan dominates the advanced semiconductor industry, and there's a rethink about the whole chip industry. There are seismic shifts here in the United States as well as other countries about incorporating industrial policy and protecting the advantages of individual countries as well. And so, yes, we want Taiwan's economy to continue flourishing on one hand, but on the other, Taiwan is also the competition as well, especially when we are trying to establish semiconductor advanced technology, resiliency and independence, and less dependence on Taiwan as well. And I think it's interesting when we talk about reconsidering the supply chain, we also want to address the idea of going up the value chain. So I actually want to hear Adnan's opinion on this too, but there is great competition among Southeast Asian countries to be like the next chip manufacturer, not necessarily for the most advanced chips, but for certainly the legacy chips. And we see countries like India, like Malaysia, competing for new investments, not just from Taiwan, but from the United States, companies like Intel as well. We also see countries like even like Costa Rica wanting to get into the semiconductor game and in terms of packaging and testing as well. And one thing that Barbara noted about the chips for alliance really not moving forward, this is one of the reasons why it's not moving forward, is that there is competition between Taiwan and South Korea when it comes to protecting their own interests in defining and protecting their own semiconductor market share worldwide. So the conclusion is that although there is an agreement about the importance of Taiwan and the geopolitical interest to ensure that Taiwan continues to thrive, from a private sector perspective, Taiwanese companies like TSMC are actually the competition in this. There is this opportunity for companies across the world to actually take advantage of the shifts, new monies that are coming in, and play a bigger role, and perhaps take away some of the advantages that Taiwan has.
Thank you very much. And I'm cognizant that there are people who have been waiting patiently. So I'd like to keep it quite short, and then you'll get an opportunity for taking questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chiyoko and Deepa, for your questions and your feedback. I think building off of what Chiyoko just said, one of the things that Taiwan is very successful at presenting its partners in Southeast Asia and specifically in India is the fact that Taiwan is willing to engage in knowledge transfer, which means Taiwan is willing to train people in those countries. They're willing to share their expertise. And microchips is one example. The other example is Taiwanese are ridiculously good at creating green energy solutions. And one of the biggest ones is the electrical scooter. So if you go to Taiwan, there's something called a go-to scooter. Comes with an electrical battery, runs out of it, go to a place, it's like a battery bank. You take one out, put it in, take the next one out. Now, that has been replicated in, I would say at this stage, 4 to 5 Southeast Asian countries, countries like Indonesia, countries like Vietnam, even countries like Laos, which are extremely close to the Chinese, are willing to take technology transfers from a place like Taiwan. So Taiwan is the competition, very true, but Taiwan is also willing to share that expertise because Taiwan's eye is on the value addition portion of it, where if we can start making really high-end things, then whether it's microchips or green equipment, it's other countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, India that can take up that mantle and continue doing that from that perspective. Taiwan's end goal is to diversify as many baskets as they can put their eggs in. And with that goal, they're willing to go ahead and make this. So there are competition, but at the same time, only super high-end stuff.
Yeah, another smart move. Barbara.
All right, I just had 2 quick points. On the economic side, I think the most difficult things on the 21st century trade agreement are issues like agriculture, which are difficult in any negotiation, digital, because the US is still figuring out what its position is, and then this non-market policies issue, because, you know, Taiwan has a lot of non-market, has a lot of state-owned enterprises that would be implicated by these kinds of policies, and we'll be sensitive about that. On economic security, I think that will be even harder because as the US is developing additional export controls and additional investment restrictions and other economic security measures. We need to find some way to calibrate that so that we're aligned with our partners. The Taiwanese government may not see the way we choose to approach it as quite aligned with their interests, and that is going to get complicated. And then there is the question of coordinating with Japan and Korea and other suppliers in order for any of these policies to be effective.
All right. And again, thank you for your patience. And now I'm happy to turn to your questions. And please identify yourself and your affiliation. And that just reminded me, I never introduced myself. It's never too late, I guess. I'm Deepa Alapali. I'm the Associate Director of the Seeger Center, Professor here at Political Science. Okay. Yes.
Hi, I'm Morgan. I just graduated from the University of Chicago. So my thesis was about how South Korea's defense strategy was impacted by the Ukraine war. And I came along upon its defense strategy, learning about how South Korea is trying to actually become a very important economic partner in AI technology. And so it seems like South Korea is getting a bit different from other countries around in East Asia and is trying to have its own market share on other aspects of the economy and technology. So I was wondering, what do you think about South Korea in terms of Taiwan? Like, do you think there is a competition that can grow even more and perhaps prevent South Korea to take a position into defending Taiwan if something happens in the future because of this competition? Or do you think it's a healthy relationship that is going on? Yeah, I was just wondering about this. Thank you.
Under the Yoon administration, there is a clear appetite for Korea to do more, that it wants to go beyond its traditionally more narrowly focused foreign policy of really focusing on how to deal with the North Korea threat, which is very real. And so there is this greater appetite for Korea to play this global Korea responsible international actor role. And when it comes to diversifying its economy, it does want to go beyond the chaebols. It does want to move up the value chain. It has a lot of issues domestically in ensuring that there is growth amongst these small and medium enterprises too. Another point that I do want to make is that Korea is changing in some of the exports that it has. It's now becoming a defense weapons exporter too, right? Selling arms to Poland and perhaps even to Ukraine as well. So there is a lot of reassessment of where Korea's competitive advantages lie and how it can actually address some of the fundamental challenges facing the Korean domestic economy as well.
Just wanted to add on this point. I think the point that you're making in the example here is really important in understanding how difficult it is when the governments go beyond the rhetoric and try to really develop specific policies that are going to advance a particular economic security goal or defense goal. And in this case, for example, countries have agreed that they want to cooperate on supply chains and they want to exchange information on supply chains. That's part of what they were going to do in the Chip 4. And when they actually sat down and tried to discuss it, they realized actually we're competitors and we really don't want to be sharing information with one another. So this is going to be really hard. What can we share? Even though we all we obviously share the goal of supply chain resilience and security, but how do we do this among competitors? So I think when you translate, it becomes hard. But I do think separate from that, the interests of the countries in working together to advance their broader military security goals are unrelated to these fights they're having about actually what kind of information they're sharing.
Good point. Thank you. Yes, young gentleman.
Now you're up.
Oh, yeah.
The red is.
Oh, all right. Thank you. I'm Jeffrey Kuo. I'm a PhD student at the economic department at the GW. This is a question for Dr. Russell. I also do the my dissertation on the new southbound policy cover a little bit. So there was a news coming out 2 days ago that Taiwan is going to sign an MOU with India that we are going to open the some of the migrant worker from India. I'm just curious about what's your take on this. Is this going to be like, like exclude some of the opportunities for the existing migrant worker from the other Southeast Asian countries, like Indonesia's workers, the Philippines workers, market in Taiwan, or these are going to be a long-term deal, you think? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. So there are a couple of things Taiwan is going through right now. One issue is the fact that Taiwanese population is on the downward trajectory, pretty similar to Japan. The difference is Taiwan sees it coming way ahead and they've learned from Japan. So they are putting into place various, I would say, solutions, preemptive solutions. A majority of the people who are coming in as migrant workers are coming in from Southeast Asia to work in low-skilled capacities. So within specifically, if you go by Kaohsiung, you get to run into a lot of Indonesians, and most of them are involved in the fishing industry. But then once you start talking about northern Taiwan, you're talking about Taoyuan, you're talking about Taipei, you're looking at folks who are hired by the tech industry. So with India, the kind of understanding that they have at least is focused on tech-based hiring. So instead of a lot of tech talent going to places like Germany, Canada, the US, why don't you come here? Because South Korea tried it, failed miserably. Japan never bothered. But Taiwan sees an opening here. They see an opening. They understand that this could be a boon for us. Singapore has been very successful with that strategy. Malaysia has been very successful with that strategy. So Taiwan is going it that way. They are not in competition with the migrant workers or the capacity that is coming in from Southeast Asia. It is of very different nature, but it kind of shows the intention of Taiwan that they're preemptively trying to find solutions to problems others have run into.
Yes, we have, I think, 30 seconds. If you can keep it very short, go ahead.
Yes, Edward Chestnut, alumni of GW, graduate of C's. Quick question. Artificial intelligence, generative AI as a solution, what's the positive attributes that Taiwan has in that area?
As a solution to the shrinking population?
That's correct.
Okay. Who would like
I
to?
kept it short.
Anybody? Yeah, you did keep it short. Thank you. So, okay, go ahead. No, please do because we're recording.
Clearly, I'm not loud enough. But there is a solution. It's not really a solution, it's a complement. The reality of life is no amount of AI or how good it is going to pay taxes into Social Security. So at the end of the day, that is going to be something that is needed. You need a population. What it does do is it helps and assists significantly with Taiwan's focus on digitization and improving the service quality to its citizens. Taiwan is already way ahead of most Asian countries when it comes down to a taxation and a infrastructure to make sure everybody is paying their due, as well as a banking industry that is improving, along with semiconductor brilliance. As far as Taiwan is concerned, AI technology is just going to make them have an extra edge on improving the quality of life of their citizens. And it makes them more attractive to potential future migrant workers that they're trying to attract, or getting more niche specializations. It just kind of adds to what Taiwan already has. Apart from that, the issues that they have in domestic politics, I know we didn't get a lot of time to discuss that, but those issues will stay. AI is a solution that can make your life easier and better. It cannot alter the realities on the ground. That's my take.
Okay, I like that take. None of us want to be obsolete or taken over by AI. All right. Well, listen, thank you so much for staying till the end. And I hope that you've had a enriching experience here. I certainly have learned a lot from both the first panel and the second panel. And I think Taiwan's work is obviously cut out for it under increasing geopolitical competition. But from what I've heard, Taiwan is in a good place in terms of its own ingenuity for coming up with really good solutions. And perhaps the rest of the world will just have to learn how much Taiwan is needed for themselves. With that, please join me in thanking my esteemed panelists, and thank you all for coming.